All right, I'll start us out. Jarod, what kinds of things did you look at when trying to decide where you wanted to apply? What attributes did you look at in different law schools when making up your mind?
So the primary thing I looked at was who recruited at the law schools, because a little bit about me, like I knew from pretty early on that I wanted to work in mergers and acquisitions. And I was looking at law firms that recruited at the schools that had big M&A practices. So a lot of the schools these types of law firms are the big corporate law firms. And so I looked at that, but I also was looking at what like banks and private equity funds recruit at the business school, because I recognized what I wanted to do was very interdisciplinary. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different elements to acquiring businesses, and to me, it wasn't that important where within mergers and acquisitions I was, so long as I was doing deals. Second thing that was important to me were the clinics. So law schools, almost every law school I know of at least, will have opportunities for students to work through at these clinics through the law school, where basically they will be taking on real clients and doing actual legal work as part of their curriculum. And this is one of the things that really led me to Wisconsin, which I probably talk about a bit more later, was that our clinics, especially our business law clinic, is a very highly regarded clinic. And then the third thing was how likely it was for me to get into the law schools, because a lot of the schools that have these attributes, you're talking like Harvard, Yale, UCLA, schools that are like that. And well, I'm not really that type of student. I'm not that good of a student. So part of what I was looking at is also, do I fit with, in applying, would I actually be realistic in getting in to the school?
Right. That was one of my other questions, is where do you think Madison sort of fits in with how likely you are to be accepted? So is it sort of middle or?
Yeah, so Wisconsin is definitely one of the better law schools. Mm-hmm. So in terms of tiering it, I mean, obviously you have like Pennsylvania, Harvard, Yale. Then you have schools like Texas, UCLA, Virginia, Michigan. But then you have like a big group of schools under that, which are like Illinois, Indiana, UNC, and Wisconsin. So in my view, that's about who you're talking about with. And at Wisconsin, at least, one of the benefits is being close to Chicago. So a lot of Chicago offices of larger law firms will recruit at Wisconsin because it's close by and it's a good school. So that really helped, because also something else in terms of admission and where you're looking at for school, you should consider where in the country it is, because where you go to school is likely, at least at the beginning of your career, going to define geographically where you're going to work. There's obviously always exceptions, but being in Wisconsin, most of the law firms that do recruit in terms of like the number of law firms, it's Wisconsin law firms, which it's not bad. I mean, a lot of the law firms that do the type of work that I'm interested in will have Milwaukee offices, and Chicago being close by makes it pretty good as well. But that is something like if you go to UCLA or Stanford or California, University of California, Berkeley, schools like that, you're most likely going to be ending up in the western part of the country. So that's just something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Who did you consult with for guidance about graduate school, law school? So did you talk to professionals in the field, and who at your university was available for you to speak to?
Yeah, so at the University of Kansas, we had a pre-law advisor, and I didn't really talk to her that much. The only thing I asked, because I knew I wanted to go to law school from like little kid age, and so I knew this was something I wanted to do, and really the only thing I reached out for was in regards to because I knew that I wanted to go to law school so young. I studied for the Lsat going into my junior year, and I took it September of my junior year, which is generally speaking 6 months to a year before most people do it. So I was thinking, I wanted to ask her if I should apply like as a junior to law school and then see if I could just defer starting a year to basically give me 2 bites at the apple. And she was like, that doesn't really work. Good idea, but law schools, well, that's just not really, they won't allow that. So
Interesting. Okay. And that leads me to my next question is, what is the general timeline for the application process? So when should people really start looking and taking the LSAT and filling out applications?
So in terms of the applications themselves, those open, I want to say sometime around September or October, and all the schools will open either on the same day or within like a week or two of each other. So it's all very similar. And then the application window closes March or April, and like when they open, they all pretty much do it together. So working backwards from that, I strongly recommend taking the LSAT, at least having an LSAT on file before you apply to schools, because if you wait till December or January, which I believe are the last, you could apply to law schools and then wait for your LSAT, which I believe the last one you can take would be in December or January of like the year before you start school, so as a senior. But I strongly recommend taking one before, so at least you have a understanding of what is likely for you in terms of what schools you can get into, because at least for me, these applications, it's not crazy expensive, but if you're going to be applying to me, like what I did, apply to 10 different schools, that's about $1,000. So I want to make sure that every school I applied to was a school I had a chance to get into. So yeah, and then the one thing, I mean, on the LSAT, I'll talk a little bit about that, because on the timing element, I do think that the LSAT is more about just putting in the time to study for it than it is about anything else, because I'm under this, I assume that everyone here is in some kind of like science STEM field, right? So that, I mean, if you're in one of those fields, I'm fairly confident that you're smart enough to do well. It's just, have you gone through the work of learning what the questions are asking you? Because in reality, so the LSAT, it's 100 questions or 101 questions, but there's only like 20 or 30 distinct like categories of questions that they're going to ask you. And you can study for these, you can prepare for them. So they may ask it in different ways, but in the end, the LSAT comes down to whether you can identify, you can basically identify 20 to 30 different question types. That's what they ask. It's really, I feel like more of a memorization thing than anything else, which just comes down to, do you have the time to memorize it? So something that I wish I would have put more thought into was, because I started studying the summer going into my junior year, knowing what I know now, I would have just kept studying throughout my junior year and taken it like late May of my junior year instead of September at the beginning of it. But yeah, that's just me.
Okay. Do any of you have any questions before I take over again? Anybody out there have questions for Jarod that spark any new questions from anyone?
I guess a question I have is like how did you go about studying for the LSAT? Because there's like practice tests or there's like books. Like, did you prefer one or the other, or did you try both?
So what I used was this program called Test Masters. Um, they have a variety of different options. You could do it in person, you could do it online, but like Zoom classes, for lack of a better word, or you could do like online recordings where it's asynchronous, so you could do it whenever you want, which is what I did, mainly because it fit within my schedule. Because that summer, going into my junior year, I was working at a hedge fund, and the hours, so it was in Chicago, but they traded in the Japanese market. And the Japanese market hours were like 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. So I couldn't really do any normal times for studying for the LSAT. So I had to do it asynchronously. And this program I really liked. It had you take a practice LSAT at the beginning, and my score at the beginning was a 141, which is you're not getting in anywhere with that score. And then by the end of it, I got a 158 on the actual LSAT, which got me into Wisconsin. So I think it was good. It is not cheap. It was like $1,000, but that gets you you could game it kind of if you know you want to use this program early enough and you know that ahead of time, you could get pretty much a full year before like it expires. Because the way they do their pricing is that you get until like the day after, you get access until the day after your scheduled LSAT, or yeah, because they like do the payments based on when you take the LSAT. And so if you know ahead of time, you could get quite a long time for a decent, for what ends up being not unreasonable. But I've seen other LSAT programs. I think they're all pretty much the same. The main thing, which I was saying earlier, just take the time, spend the hours to do it. I think that's a lot more important than any one specific prep program you use.
Yeah, I think a lot of those standardized tests are testing to see if you actually took the time to do the work, because then that would show that you know what you can apply those skills while you're in law school, right?
And
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say also the LSAT, I don't know why they do it the way they do it, but the material itself is not really what you're going to ever do in law school. Like it's logic and like logic games, which is important. It is you should know these types of things, but the way you engage with the material on the LSAT will never, like that's not how law school works. So it's kind of not a useful barometer in terms of like the information that you're going to learn or anything like that. But apparently it predicts skill or your academic outcomes somewhat well because they do it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. All right. Any other questions out there before I throw?
I have one this time. So when you are applying or whatever, so you need the LSAT, is there anything else? Like I know when you apply for college, like you need your ACT or whatever.
So you need your LSAT. You're going to need a GPA. You'll also have to have graduated with a bachelor's degree, which if you're asking about this, you probably, being in here, like you probably will have a bachelor's degree. I think that's a safe bet. Your application will also need some number of references. Some schools require 1. I've seen some that require 3. What else? You'll have to submit a resume. Cover letter. What is basically a cover letter, although they may use a different word to say it, but something explaining your interest in law school. And many schools, they don't require this, but if you fall under any of the diversity stuff, they'll often have it like diversity statement that if you do fall under any of the diversity stuff, where under the school the diversity statement is something you can write, I recommend doing it because it's just something else that can help make a difference, make you stand out more.
You mentioned resume. So to me, it sounds like getting work experience or some sort of internship would be a good idea during undergrad to enhance your application. Is that true?
Yeah, it's definitely something you want to do is have some, you may not necessarily need work experience itself, but you're going to need experiences other than just you went to school, you got your grades, whatever. It could be extracurricular, like I was involved in 3 or 4 different organizations in a leadership position. It could be like part-time jobs during the school year, it'd be internships. Like for me, I had an internship at a hedge fund, and then I had an internship at Spirit Aerosystems, which is a aerospace supplier. They build the structures for Boeing and Airbus, and I worked like on their corporate strategy and did some M&A work with them. One thing you do want to be cognizant of is that your work experience may there may be people who, if you're coming from undergrad, and I'll talk about me, for example, I had a lot of finance internships. I did consulting, hedge fund, corporate development. This is stuff that coming out of undergrad looks really good, but there's also going to be people who are going to be applying to law schools from work. So investment bankers, people in private equity, which are like full-time job equivalents of what I did basically. So my work experience, while like that may be distinctive from undergrad, people applying to undergrad, people coming from the workforce, that may not be as impressive as it is. So that is something to consider. There's not much you can do about it, but looking at, especially because it's going to be a lot of, in terms of applying to schools, a lot of it's random and a lot of it's luck, because it's you applying to the school based, I mean, every class is different. And yeah, there's broad trends that always will generally be followed. But you, like for me, I may be the 20th person who applied to the University of Illinois who had this heavy finance background, but they were only going to take 19 because they don't want to have too many people who have the same background. So this is something that, in terms of like applying to schools, it's not something you can control for. It's not something you could do much about, but it is something to note that in applying, you may not have gotten into a school, you may be waitlisted at a school where you may have fit in a variety of different ways, but you were just like the 20th person and they were only taking 19.
Right. You're only competing with who else applies that year.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Which is also something at the University of Wisconsin Law School, is something that is in a pretty unique position because law school relatively used to be pretty small. It was like 100 people until like per class until like 10, 15 years ago. My class is now 250 people, and the class after me is going to be about 270. So there is massive growth at the University of Wisconsin's law school. And if you can see that, which to some extent you do have visibility into, because law schools are required by the ABA to disclose a lot of information regarding like their incoming class. So GPAs, Lsats, the number of people who applied, who were extended offers, who were ended up enrolling. You could look this all up. It's if you look up like insert law school and then ABA disclosures or like ABA section 509 disclosures. It's a form that it's pretty easy to read, pretty easy to follow, and everyone has to do it. So this is a good starting. I think that's a good starting point for also determining if you can get into the school. And it could also, because it tells you the number of people who are extended offers and who are admitted, you can track that over time and see, like, is it a school that went from 200 kids to 5 years ago to 270 next year, or is it flat? Those are things that also are worth considering.
Great. Other questions?
I have another one. So, like when you go to grad school or whatever, you can apply for scholarships so you don't have to pay for the whole thing. So 2 questions. So I guess it's different for every school for how expensive it is, but then are there scholarships that you could get or no?
There's the schools, most law schools that I applied to did have scholarships that like I saw. I didn't qualify for them because I'm too rich, basically. But there are definitely opportunities, and a lot of the law firms, once you get into law school, they'll have well, it's mainly for diversity related scholarships, but they'll give you scholarship money, 10, 15, even $20,000 if you if you go through the program. So these diversity scholarships are generally also associated with working. Like they're not just giving it money to people just to give them money. It's meant as a hiring tool. So you'll work for them after your first year. This will put you on a fast track for an internship after your second year. And one thing that's really important is your internship after your second year, so going into your third year, your last summer in law school. That is very determinative of what you will do out of school, because at least for law firms, they hire those interns with the expectation of hiring 100% of them as full-time associates when they graduate. So if you don't get an internship at that summer, it's not going to be a huge, like, it's not like you can't get certain opportunities, but it's going to be for a far smaller number of positions that you'll be going after. Not to say that you can't do it, but it greatly increases your probability of getting the job you want by having an internship that second summer. And something to note is with law firms, they start recruiting incredibly early. Like so for summer internships for the second summer, which I'm applying to now, like Wisconsin has 2 main on-campus recruiting programs for law firms. That is the first one's one, they participate with multiple schools. That was done June and July of this summer. So the summer after your first year was when you started interviewing for jobs at corporate law firms for your second summer. The on-campus recruiting for like Wisconsin specifically, it's done in 2 phases. I don't know if that's normal or not, but that I just had interviews for Monday and Tuesday of this week. So if you want to do corporate work at like the law firms, that they start recruiting really early. But also public defenders, prosecution offices, the corporations, nonprofits, those type of law people, entities that hire law students, they recruit at a much more normal schedule. That's going to be November, December, January for when most of the recruiting gets done. And those are other places as well that you could look for scholarship money, because I know there are nonprofits that are like the law firms. They recognize that giving students money to pay for school can get them in your pipeline. And especially for the more nonprofits, stuff and like that type of work, like the ACLU, they know that law school is expensive. And if they can help reduce the financial costs, then more people are willing to take the lower paying jobs, because people who may be interested in being a lawyer for the ACLU would maybe, like, there's people who would really like to do that, but because law school is expensive, they can't afford to have those jobs. So there's definitely independent scholarship money like that, but also the schools do try to make sure that you can afford it. This is especially true at super elite schools, where like you get into Virginia or Georgetown, they're going to do what they can to make sure you can go there, because to them the talent's worth more than the whatever $20, $40, $50,000 in scholarships extra they'd have to give to people. Wisconsin's in a little bit of a unique situation because it is a good school and they do give money, but the government hasn't exactly been funding education as much, and the law school especially has been having some financial concerns. So they aren't as like you get in, we're going to find a way to get you here in terms of money, but they do give a good amount of money if you need it.
Great. Good question. Other questions?
Something else actually I want to add on that, in terms of schools, in terms of being able to pay for stuff like tuition scholarships. One thing to consider is if you do a clinic, those experiential opportunities the schools provide, at least at Wisconsin, and this is the last year it's going to happen. So if you're considering to going to Wisconsin, this won't be available to you going forward. But a lot of clinics will, if you do clinic work, it's a job. And if there's a summer component to it, they will pay for the tuition associated with that. So, for example, I had 7 credit hours of academic credit for my clinic this summer. For me as an out-of-state student, that's about $7,000-8,000 of tuition that I'm not paying for. I'm also, and this is somewhat unique to Wisconsin, where they'll cover any additional classes that I take during the summer. So I just took the final for a 3 credit hour course in evidence, and that's another $3,000 to $4,000. So that's $10,000 of credits that I didn't have to pay for, and that's 10 credit hours is 1/9 a degree. So that is also something worth considering.
That's great. Other questions? Okay, I have another question. How is your graduate school, law school experience different from undergraduate school?
So I think there's 2 ways to talk about that. The first is academically, and which I'll talk about first, and then also the living social environment element to it. So academically, it is coming from business school. It's like fundamentally different. Law school is very much about you figuring things out, like on your own. Very much because a lot of the way your first year courses at least will work is that you'll have readings that you'll be expected to do outside of class, which gonna be a pretty decent amount of reading, and you'll be expected to know it. And then going into class, it's going to be more about how do you apply the laws, cases, whatever you just read to specific facts, to specific cases, to take the stuff that you learned, like this is law X, but what does that, in class, it'll be more like, what does that mean? It'll be more about, do these facts meet that law and stuff like that, where in undergrad, at least for me, in business school, it's very much the teachers telling you in class, this is what you need to know, and then going out of class and just doing work to like really ingrain that in you, which is a very different way academically. But one of the nice things being from a business school is that, not at least at Kansas, it's a separate building. It's like pretty isolated from the rest of the schools, which is very similar to law school, where all your law classes are likely to be in the same building. You're going to see the same people all the time. So that was a familiar part for me. And then more like living social elements of it. Well, COVID kind of made it so I can never really know apples to apples, but broadly speaking, I've had a pretty easy transition because at Kansas, I lived in a dorm freshman year, then on camp, and then in an off-campus apartment for 3 years. I'm living off-campus apartment at Wisconsin now. Lawrence, Kansas is basically the stereotype of like a Midwestern college town in like the most literal way I can mean that. I view Madison, at least, as being the same thing for a city school. Like this is like the University of Wisconsin in Madison is what I expect a city school to be, like almost to a T. So a lot of things for me transferred over. It was very similar. But yeah, I can't really, I don't really know too much socially because of COVID. So most things in Madison weren't open, were half open and not really the same. So I can't really go too much into that.
Okay. Anybody else want to chime in? All right. Do you think at a dual degree, like a JD and MA, is a good route for graduate school?
It's very dependent on what you want. A lot, if you are interested in things like patent law or working in like venture capital related stuff, technology type stuff, it is useful, especially on the patent side. If you have that's what you're interested in doing, patent law, it is very strongly encouraged to have a science background. So if you're going to do like a joint degree in like engineering or science or biology, whatever it is, that is very highly looked upon. Business like business law, corporate law type work, it's very dependent on what you want to do. It's just so fact specific because a lot of times in terms of business, it will neither hurt you nor help you. It will just be something, well, it'll make you stand out because I mean, getting like an MBA as well is like, it's a signifier that does mean something, but I don't really see it being a determinative thing. Getting a master's degree like in finance along with a JD could be helpful if you come from like a science background and you want to go more into corporate stuff. It could give you a platform of corporate knowledge, of business knowledge. So that could be helpful if you're changing careers or you're moving from different like fields.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's see. Talked about a lot of this stuff. What about delaying law school? What circumstance would that be helpful or not helpful to someone?
So the first thing would be if you have to take care of family situations or anything like that, do that. Law schools will understand. If let's say you applied and then something came up where, like, use me, my parents got sick and then they were the ones who were going to pay for a big chunk of my living expenses. That if I reached out to Wisconsin saying, hey, like, I'm not going to be able to afford it this year because I have these medical bills that I have to help my parents with, people get that. Don't, if that's a reason, like, that is understood. Specific experiences as well, such as being like a Fulbright scholar or doing something like really something that the law school can sell. Like if you're experienced Fulbright scholar, if you're if your parents were an ambassador to a foreign country, something like that, like they're just nominated, going and spending time there. The main thing you want to ask is the experience like actually helpful? And if it is, then do that. But if you're just going to, I'll use Grey's Anatomy as an example. If you're going to backpack across the across Europe for a summer, for like a year, and then go on to law school, that may not be as helpful. But the main thing is you want to make that time off matter. I have a friend who originally wasn't going to go to law school, but COVID hit. He graduated in 2020 and he was like, well, there's no opportunities really for the specific thing that I want to do. I was considering law school, but like, it's like I had to, be an adult, and COVID gave him the opportunity to be like, well, I can actually like go to law school. So he's going to law school starting in the fall, which is kind of a unique thing where if something big, world changing happens, that could be a valid reason as well.
Okay. I know we have only a few minutes left, so does anyone have any questions that you've been holding on to that you still want to ask? This might be your last chance. Okay. Well, I know related to what you just said, you also were talking about competing with people who had been out in the workforce. And so I was just wondering if maybe that could be an advantage for someone if they did go out into the workforce for a year or two and get some more experience on their resume, if that could enhance their application. I guess it depends on the person and what they've done.
Very fact dependent on what your work experience is, what your interests are. It's one of the, there's no real broad way of talking about it. Like if you could go work at Goldman Sachs and for 2 years and then go to law school, like that's probably helpful.
That'd probably look good.
That will make you stand out. But broadly speaking, most law schools will take more kids straight from undergrad than out of the workforce. I think that mainly has to do with just more undergrads apply than people out of the workforce, but that is something to be cognizant of, is that breakdown, because some schools will be more 50-50 or 40-60 in favor of out of the workforce people, where others will be more 60-40 undergrad or even more, which is something to consider, because especially if you're a borderline in terms of like your GPA, Lsat, your resume is going to matter a lot more. And if you're applying to schools where it's more heavily out of the workforce applicants, you're going to have a lot more unique or impactful experiences in order to make up for that, for lack of a better word.
Right. That makes sense. There's a lot that goes into the application, obviously, a lot of different pieces. So just a few minutes left, and I know Jarod has been really helpful in telling us about law school, but especially from sort of that business side of law school. So does anybody have other questions from sort of other areas of law that maybe Jarod could speak to? Sydney.
Hey, I want to do environmental law, so I don't know how that works or what I would do.
It's funny that environmental law, got an email earlier today from the career services about the EPA having their recruiting starting now. But environmental law, I imagine if there'd be a lot of like nonprofit work. I mean, there will be lawyers at businesses that handle nonprofit stuff, especially large ones. The obvious ones being oil and gas companies, anything in the aerospace industry, they will have lawyers who touch on that. It may not be like exclusively, he's the environmental lawyer, but you may have like regular projects touching on that. In terms of classes, I'm fairly confident most law schools will cover to some extent environmental law, in part because law schools tend to be more progressive institutions, broadly speaking, and the environment is a more progressive topic. So you will get that to some extent. I don't really know a lot about environmental law or the details of that. Yeah, the one thing I would say is with environment, like being interested in the environment, there are a lot of different ways you could go about that. Because something I was just thinking of is how in patent law, that type of stuff, you could focus on environmental products that are looking to be patented. You could do things in like farming or I'm forgetting others, but there's industries that deal with this type of work. So yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. What other specialties are you aware of at Madison? Like some of your colleagues are sort of specializing in.
So one thing that has been something that both Wisconsin and Marquette Law School have been fairly good at is sports law, which is an especially interesting time now that student athletes can actually make money on the fact that they're student athletes, which is something that I've been participating in because my clinic, the business law clinic at the law school, we have been working to try and help set up legal services for student athletes. That's something that the Wisconsin Law School especially, and Marquette more so, but Wisconsin as well, are pretty good at is the sports law elements. There's the normal like criminal law stuff, which there's a lot of public interest law on the criminal side that goes on at Wisconsin. We have a lot of courses in criminal law. We have a lot of people who recruit law firms. A lot of the law firms that I've been talking about on their corporate side also recruit heavily for their criminal work. Oh, something just popped out.
Yeah, we've got just under a minute left.
Yeah.
So it'll force us out in like 49 seconds. All right. So thank you very much, Jarod. That was very helpful. Hopefully everybody else found it helpful too. Thanks for joining us. And I guess we'll see you in 30 some seconds over on and we'll have another discussion with an advisor who can hopefully help you out some more. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks, Jarod.